Sorry to be in class today, and sorry for the delay in getting this out. Hopefully we shouldn't have any troubles now. You may need to adjust your volume a little bit because it looks like it's pretty loud on my side. We left off the other day talking about the Julio-Claudian emperors, and I apologize, I went one slide too far. And we looked at Tiberius as the first emperor after the rule of Octavian. And really, Tiberius has some good qualities about him. But as we mentioned, his neuroticism got the best of him. And so, upon his death, Caligula comes to the throne. Now, Caligula began his reign with some very enthusiastic support from the people of Rome. They actually turned Tiberius' funeral into a celebration for the new emperor, calling him a star, the best thing, and so on and so forth. And so why were they so enthusiastic? Well, Caligula's father, Germanicus, had been loved by the Roman people. He was a great general. And most people were hoping that Caligula would take after his father. And that's clearly what his daddy wanted him to do. When Caligula was a little boy, he was dressed up in a military uniform. He had been taken to military camps time and again. The soldiers loved him, even had military-style boots. And they actually called the boy Little Boots, and that's where we get the name Caligula from. At the end of the last class, if you remember, I talked about Caligula just very quickly and mentioned that the new emperor was named Gaius. But his nickname was Little Boots or Caligula, and so that's typically in history what we refer to him as. But after Caligula's father had passed away, his childhood was a nightmare. His relatives were killed left and right, victims of Sejanus' plots or Tiberius' paranoia, and Caligula began his reign with a lot of psychological baggage. Now add to that the strain of being thought of and looked at as a god. It's not easy to be a god in the eyes of people. For one thing, it's hard to find an appropriate wife. So you need a goddess, right? If you're a god, you need a goddess to marry. So Caligula sought a wife who was a goddess. He prayed that the goddess of the moon would join him as his wife. But she must not have answered him back because he had to start looking someplace else. And there's a family in Rome producing gods and goddesses, isn't there? Yes, his own family. And where can he find a goddess? Well, what about his sister Drusilla? So with all the psychological baggage, we're now going to add incest, and disaster is on his way. And when his beloved Drusilla dies, well, that was really the last thread connecting Caligula to any reality. And he doesn't deal well with problems, and those problems he doesn't deal with them rationally. He finds out he's getting a higher butcher bill. He's about maintaining the lions and the tigers and the bears for the circus, and it's very expensive. So he looks for a supply of cheap meat to feed all his animals. So what does he do? He goes out to the prison, picks up a bunch of prisoners, and has them slaughtered and fed to the animals. And it did lower his butcher bill, but it does show you kind of his disconnect with reality. He also takes advantage of his power to exploit both men and women sexually, forcing them to engage in all types of perversions. And if one didn't go along with it, he killed them. He kept his prisoners in cages too small, so they couldn't stand up and they couldn't lie down. He had people sawn in half. He had people subjected to the death of 1,000 paper cuts, basically. He forced parents to laugh and to joke while he executed their sons in front of their eyes. Eventually, he insulted the wrong people, members of his own personal guard, and the guardsmen themselves eventually killed him and his wife and his baby daughter. And so now we have a new emperor, Caligula's uncle Claudius. And Claudius was a well-meaning, scholarly man. He studied a lot of history. He wrote a lot of books on Augustus, and was probably the last man to know well the ancient Etruscan language. Unfortunately, he was not a kind man. He was not the kind of man who can be easily accepted as an emperor. He spoke with a stutter. He walked with a limp. Something of a buffoon, kind of a joke, and Caligula probably only let him live because he enjoyed making fun of his uncle. To make matters worse, Claudius wasn't very good at picking out wives. His third wife, Melusina, was a beautiful young woman. Claudius was very much in love with him, but a beautiful young woman is not very likely to find an awkward man in his 50s much to her taste. So she cheated on him, left and right, was pretty open about it. And Claudius already having a very hard time with the fact that he doesn't have the emperor image, has an even tougher time when his wife doesn't show him any respect. Finally, Melusina goes too far, actually staged a mock marriage ceremony to one of her lovers. And since, and that was kind of the last straw for Claudius. He couldn't bring himself to deal with his wife, and so he did give his friends the authority to do so. And when adultery involves a king or a queen or an empress, it was regarded as an act of treason, and so his wife and her lover were both executed. And now a new wife for Claudius, Agrippina. Agrippina was an attractive young woman. She had a lot more political smarts than his former wife, and she really wrapped Claudius around her little finger and tried to run the empire through him. But Claudius was wishy-washy, and Agrippina really couldn't persuade him to say he was going to take a certain course of action. It was very frustrating for Agrippina. She wanted to be on the throne. Or she wanted at least someone on the throne who was more dependable and more consistent in carrying out her own wishes. And so she convinces Claudius to adopt her son from a previous marriage, Nero. And as soon as Claudius adopts Nero, Agrippina poisons Claudius. Therefore, Nero comes to the throne. And at first, everything goes well. He's only 16. His mother and her advisors are running things pretty much. Eventually, Nero gets tired of his mother's interference. One area of a lot of conflict was Nero's marriage. Agrippina had insisted that Nero marry a woman named Octavia, who was actually one of the last surviving relatives of Augustus. Nero wanted to marry his mistress, but Nero was afraid to disobey his mother. And so, being emperor, he could get her out of the picture so he could do what he wanted to do. So, in AD 59, he actually had his own mother executed. And from that point forward, Nero could do what he wanted to do. And he simply could have divorced Octavia, but instead he charged her with adultery, had her executed, and gives her severed head to his mistress as a present. He's also now free to indulge his tastes in other areas. He saw himself as a great artist, and so he launched an artistic career. But what he didn't do was effectively govern Rome. His misappropriation of government funds provoked serious revolts in Britain and Judea, and in Rome, Nero failed to handle the Great Fire of AD 64. Instead of doing his best to put the fire out, he supposedly went to the streets with his lyre, which is a musical instrument, singing about the fall of Troy. Naturally, a man like this provokes a lot of enemies, but Nero was determined to get them before they got him. And so he executed many senators because he thought they would plot against him. He executed the greatest general, and this proved a mistake. Nero's other generals throughout the empire were afraid that he might do the same thing to him or to them, and so they began to march their troops toward Rome in an effort to overthrow Nero. Nero panics and kills himself. Now this plunges Rome into a new period of civil war. And over the course of 1 year, they actually had 4 emperors, each one using their own troops in their quest for power. Roman troops sacked and destroyed Roman cities and even attacked the city of Rome itself. And for the next 30 years, the Flavian dynasty provided the emperor with effective rule, but it was somewhat autocratic. Now, the next in line of emperors were what were called the Antoines, or the 5 good emperors. An end to autocracy and a return to the principle of administration of equality between the emperor and the Senate really characterized the rule of the 5 good emperors. Selected on the basis of ability, these good emperors succeeded in reconciling things long thought incompatible: supreme power and liberty. And 2 of the emperors we're actually going to talk about for just a second. The first was Hadrian, and he reigns, as your PowerPoint slide shows you, from 117 to 138 AD. His first important act was to stabilize the boundaries of the empire. He gave up the areas of Armenia and Mesopotamia because he couldn't defend them. He erects walls in Germany and Britain. The one in Britain was 20 feet high as a way to protect them. He travels extensively throughout the empire, inspecting almost every province of the empire. And towns were founded, old ones restored, and a lot of public works were constructed. Among them, the famous Pantheon in Rome. What Hadrian was good at doing was identifying things that need to be fixed and doing something about it, but also being able to identify things that weren't able to be fixed, such as provinces that he could not protect, and getting rid of them. Now, the last of the 5 good emperors was Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from AD 161 to 180. And he was more of a philosopher king, if you will. He preferred quiet contemplation in his books. He didn't really like the battlefield, but he was repeatedly troubled by invasions from the east. And while he was engaged in his Germanic campaigns, he wrote his Meditations, which was a collection of personal thoughts. Ironically, the stoic manner in which Christian martyrs accepted death did not impress him. He said, "What an admirable soul that is, which is ready, if at any moment it must be separated from the body. This readiness must come from a man's own judgment, not from mere obstinacy, but with reason and dignity, if it is to persuade another and without tragic show." Marcus Aurelius had a love of humanity, and he really was troubled by the invasions and the toll it took on humanity, and so he did everything he could to protect the citizens of Rome, much like Hadrian did. But like a good philosopher king, he died at his post in Vienna, and at Rome, his equestrian statue still stands on the hill, saluting the returning legions as they came back to Rome. Now, between 180 and 280 AD, there are 28 Roman emperors, 20 of them dying by violence. Civil war is once again constant, assassinations are common, and the empire is beset by external problems and invasions. This should have brought down the government, but Augustus had set up a strong bureaucracy. Instability at the center did not bother the rest of the government. It was simply loyalty to whoever was in charge. Now, that's the end of today's lecture. On Wednesday, we just have a few more things to talk about. So we'll finish that up on Wednesday, and then we'll also go over your study guide to make sure you have any questions. So go ahead and look at your study guide for Wednesdays. I'll be in my office tomorrow sometime around noon or 1 if you need to stop by and talk with me. If not, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.